So all of us, I think, have been in a sort of paradoxical situation where we read a paper that proposes a constraint C on a construction X and illustrates its relevance by showing us occurrences of the construction that violate C and that seem to be unacceptable. And then we do corpus research, or we just introspect, and we find examples of X that violate C and seem perfectly acceptable. So a case in point is Dussault and Stativity. Since their paper of the 60s, most people believe, since the paper of Lakoff and Ross of the 60s, most people believe that Dussault doesn't allow stative antecedents. And this has been repeated throughout the literature up to, for instance, Kluckover and Jackendorf, who give an example like one, Robin dislikes Ozzy, but Leslie doesn't do so, and they star it, and it really sounds bad. But there are naturally occurring examples of Dussault with stative antecedents, and in fact, if we were better keeping track of the literature, we would know this since 1978, because a compatriot of mine and Frank and Annie wrote a short paper in 1978 in which he collected examples of Dussault with stative antecedents, embarrassingly mostly in articles by linguists. So, for instance, in 2, the basic idea is that whenever the relation of complementary distribution holds between phones belonging to a common phoneme, more stative than that is hard to find, it does so because the phonetic value of the phoneme, blah, blah, blah. And if you read this, in the book, I'm sure you'll never notice that there's a Dussault with a stative antecedent. It's perfectly natural. And Hauser, in recent corpus work, confirmed that you find about 2% of finite Dussault with stative antecedents in his corpus. So I propose to try to explain what's going on here by invoking an idea of usage preferences. So what are usage preferences, or UPs? These are statistically significant preferences in usage. They can concern basically anything about language, lexical semantics, syntax, discourse. And usually, if you violate a single UP, there's no effect on acceptability, but multiple violations can be cumulative and have a strong effect on acceptability. So let me propose 3 UPs for finite Dussault. The first, finite Dussault, very strongly prefers to occur with non-stative antecedents. This is Hauser. He had 98% of the cases. Finite Dussault very strongly prefers to occur referring to the same state of affairs as its antecedent, and hence has the same subject as its antecedent. And in my corpus, I had 98% of cases conforming to that. These are strong usage preferences. UP3 is much weaker. Finite Dussault prefers to occur with a non-contrastive adjunct. It doesn't have the same status, and I don't have time to get into it right now. So if we look at the Kullikover and Jackendorf sentence that was starred, we can see that it violates all 3 of these usage preferences, whereas the one that was good only violates the first, the state of antecedent restriction. So what is the grammaticality of sentences that violate one or more of these usage preferences? Well, I claim that you really have to say that they're all grammatical, so that the number 1 is grammatical. It shouldn't be starred. If you don't accept that these things are grammatical, then you have to accept one of the following 2 positions. Either combining violations that do not individually lead to ungrammaticality can lead to ungrammaticality. Or you have to conversely accept that some individual violations of grammatical constraints can have no influence on acceptability. And that's what happens if you take these preferences to actually be grammatical constraints rather than preferences. And I propose that we need a new type of judgment, which I symbolize with a down arrow, which is what I would say is the right judgment for 8, for Robin dislikes Ozzy, but Leslie doesn't do so. And this is a kind of unacceptability that's different from syntactic ill-formedness or from semantico-pragmatic ill-formedness or from variation. In fact, if you think about what Arregui et al. Do in their recycling hypothesis paper, where they study mismatched antecedents with verb phrase ellipsis, and they propose that what happens is they're always ungrammatical, but they're more or less acceptable depending on exactly what kinds of violations you have, and they have this cumulative effect. And so essentially, they are taking what was my position too. They're considering these things that I'm talking about as preferences, as grammatical constraints, and they're saying that you can violate some without, and sort of, it's a different take on the same, you get at the same place by a different path. Their idea is that some cases of verb phrase ellipsis are ungrammatical, but they're acceptable, and I'm saying the opposite. I'm saying, I'm trying to construct this in another way, and I think that, I'll try to argue why I think this way is better. Okay, so that was the introduction. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about discourse constraints as usage preferences for what I call, following Ivan, post-auxiliary ellipsis rather than verb phrase ellipsis. That was a name that you proposed in your dissertation, and which I actually coined again myself, probably because I remembered having read it in your dissertation and forgot subsequently. But then, thankfully, I noticed that it was in the dissertation before claiming that I'd invented it a second time. So in the recent paper that Jeff and I wrote in the volume, we call it post-auxiliary ellipsis because, of course, it's a much better name than verb phrase ellipsis. So in recent work, Laura Kurtz made what seems to me to be the most significant contribution up to now to our understanding of why sometimes voice mismatches are acceptable with verb phrase ellipsis and why sometimes they're not. Of course, the problem with saying that it's just semantics is that you would predict that there would never be a problem with a voice mismatch. And so I don't have time to explain what she did, but basically it has to do with different discourse uses of verb phrase ellipsis, some of which allow active passive mismatches and others which don't. And in the same spirit, Jeff and I, and in work that I did before, have been working on the constraints on verb phrase ellipsis in discourse. And what we essentially did in the paper that's in the Ivan volume is suggest that there's nothing special about exophoric verb phrase ellipsis or exophoric post-auxiliary ellipsis. It's just that the discourse constraints on anaphoric uses of verb phrase ellipsis are hard to satisfy exophorically, but as soon as you do, it's going to be okay. So trying to apply this to the case of nominal antecedents, I started from an example that I found in the COCA, and which I think everyone will agree is just perfect. Mubarak's survival is impossible to predict, and even if he does, his plans to make his heir apparent, to make his son his heir apparent, is now in serious jeopardy. So, what is it about this example that makes it so good? It's not the noun survival, because look at 2. Mubarak's survival was surprising to many. We're still not sure how he did. Everyone, I think, agrees that that sounds awful. You can only say how he did it. What is the difference between the two? These are very robust corpus-based data. I still need to test them psycholinguistically. So to explain this, I need to invoke some discourse constraints on post-auxiliary ellipsis, which I'm going to summarize very briefly. So you have to distinguish different types, and the type we're interested in here we call aux-choice post-auxiliary ellipsis, which is characterized by the fact that the subject of the antecedent is identical to the subject of the PAE construction, and the auxiliary is at least weakly stressed. So what you're changing is usually polarity. John likes Mary, John likes Mary, no he doesn't. And there's a discourse condition on this we propose, which is that a choice between the members of a jointly exhaustive set of alternative situations must be highly salient in the discourse context, and the point of the utterance containing the post-auxiliary ellipsis must be strictly limited to selecting one member of the set. So that's a mouthful, but let me illustrate it. Did Kim decide to leave? A yes-no question makes salient an alternative between P and not P, and that makes it felicitous to say yes she did or no she didn't. Kim decided to leave, assertion places P on the table, so to speak, and makes the alternative salient, and the addressee can either confirm or contradict. You can say no, she didn't. But notice that Kim's decision to leave came as a surprise. It's really hard to follow that by no, she didn't. And what I'm going to suggest is that saying no, she didn't, to mean she didn't decide to leave, is in fact violating a usage preference on post-auxiliary ellipsis. I'm going to recast this discourse condition as a usage preference. So, why is it that this survival case can satisfy the condition that I had? Well, I noticed that what's special about survival is that it can denote a polar question. So it can occur in contexts where you get indirect interrogatives, as in 7. That depends on his survival can mean on whether or not he survives. And there are actually very few nouns, at least I found very few, that have this property. It's an interesting property of lexical semantics, why they do exactly. So at this stage, her participation is still unclear. Whether or not she will participate is still unclear. But in 9, that depends on his decision really cannot mean on whether or not he decides. It will mean on what he decides. So it has the interpretation of a WH question and not a polar question. And of course, the fact that survival can denote a polar question brings up the alternative. And in a context like the one that was the Coca example, we actually have the alternative that is made salient by an indirect by the is impossible to predict, which is an interrogative-inducing context, and that's what makes it good. But if I try the variant in 2, I get something bad. Mubarak's survival was surprising to many. There's no question in there. There's no alternative. We're still not sure how he did. Bad. Okay, we're still not sure how he did it. Okay? And I can actually find, now that I know the pattern, on the internet, more attested examples like the one in 3. And with decision, number 4, it doesn't work. Mubarak's decision is impossible to predict, but even if he doesn't work because decision doesn't allow this yes-no question reading. Okay? All of the attested examples that have been found, and there are very few, satisfy these kinds of constraints. So examples from Hart and Kaler, or examples found by Ward, I could show you that they satisfy these types of constraints. Now, why is all this so important? Well, if you ignore these discourse conditions on post-auxiliary ellipsis, what happens is you do things like what Robert, Matsuo, and Duffield do in a recent paper, where they're trying to go further in the discussion of these mismatch problems that Frazier and her collaborators, Clifton, etc., have been working on for so long, and they do these eye-tracking tests on material where they alternate things like exposed important secrets with exposure of important secrets and try to show that it's degraded with exposure. But the problem is that since they have no idea of what the discourse conditions are that make verb phrase ellipsis natural and that make it possible to use nominal antecedents, they get really terrible results for predictable reasons. And so what I want to do now is to I'm constructing material that satisfies the discourse conditions, and we're going to do a parallel eye-tracking experiment with Barbara Helmforth to the one that the Robert, Matsuo, and Duffield did, and try to see if we get different results, and I bet that we will, because we will now have, instead of having things that are completely unnatural uses of verb phrase ellipsis, we'll have natural uses to compare with. And interestingly, in a recent paper, Grant, Clifton, and Frazier noticed that certain types of examples with what they call non-actuality implicatures, so things like Kaler's attested example, this problem was to have been looked into, but obviously nobody did, are better with these mismatches. And in fact, this is a subcase of the condition I was invoking, because of course, if you were to have looked into a problem, there's the possibility that you did look in or that you did not look in. And so these are the types of things that we noticed also license exophoric verb phrase ellipsis. So, conclusions. There's a lot more stereotypicality in language use than you might think. And knowledge of usage, I think, is a part of linguistic competence. And so, to paraphrase the title of a paper by Neumeyer, which was something like Grammar is Grammar and Usage is Usage, what I would say is that grammar is a kind of competence, but usage is also a kind of competence. And people really are aware of these usage preferences, otherwise they couldn't follow them. I mean, how could they be following them if they weren't aware of them, if they weren't part of their competence? Not the same thing as their grammar competence, maybe, but it's still part of linguistic competence. And the big problem is that as long as you ignore these examples, then you're ignoring relevant properties for acceptability, and you're in danger of ascribing to a problem of grammar things that are just not respecting the way people usually speak. And so you really have to construct your examples, if you want to argue that something's ungrammatical, to be sure that they conform to usual patterns of speech so that you don't get cumulative effects of unusual, dispreferred ways of expression that lead you to an acceptability completely independently of any syntactic property. And so the conclusion is that when something is unexpectedly acceptable, you shouldn't throw it out. You should think about it and try to think about what you can do with it. And if you can't do anything, you should put it in the footnotes, which is what Ivan always does since his dissertation. Ted?
You said at some point that the view of Arregui, I don't know how to say her last name, Clifton and Frazier was that pretty much they arrived at the same view as you did, but from different directions. And it seems like I thought it was kind of the opposite view. So I'm just like, I want to just like clarify what you mean by.
No, I think it's completely different. But I mean, no.
These are grammatical, ungrammatical but acceptable, and you're saying they're completely grammatical. So
No. But see, the thing is, it's we're both claiming that there are degrees of acceptability, and I would claim that all of these degrees of acceptability correspond to grammaticality, and it's just that by violating, cumulatively violating usage preferences, you get things that are quite unacceptable even though they're grammatical, and I have a much bigger argumentation to claim that that's what makes most sense. They have the same kind of thing, except that they're saying that these are differences of acceptability between things that are all ungrammatical, which I think it can be argued to make no sense.
I would agree. I was wondering why you said it was the same thing. It seems
no.
not the same thing at all.
It's not the same thing at all. No, I agree. It's not the same thing at all. What I meant is that we both have intermediate levels, except that I think they don't define theirs as well, because they don't understand the discourse factors as well. And also, I think that they don't realize that some of these are perfect. They're not slightly degraded. They are totally impeccable. And I just can't see what it means that something violates a grammatical constraint and is undetectable as being unacceptable. Carl raised his hand first, sorry.
How do you characterize the difference between ungrammaticality and unusagey?
Yeah. Because
let me try to make that question a little clearer, if possible. Maybe ungrammaticality is just a very extreme case of usage.
Maybe it's just because I grew up as a Chomskyan, I read Chomsky when I was young. Maybe,
so is the difference between...
No, I don't know.
Is the matter of degree?
I still believe it's qualitative. I sort of still believe that there's a difference, that there are things that are in the grammar that you can't violate, and you can't put the determiner behind the noun in English. It's just not a usage preference, I think. But maybe, I have no proof of that. It's an intuition. It's a place I start from. But I can see where you're. I'm completely clear there are people who would believe that it's all that. But I would like to try to argue for a position that has both. It's a compromise between some sort of strict functionalist view where you would say that everything is usage. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but how do you argue for it?
I don't think you can. I think those are just deep epistemological guesses that we make and that guide our work. I don't think at this point you can really make a cogent argument. Tom, okay.
In answer to Ted, you said that you didn't think it made any sense to talk about something being ungrammatical but acceptable.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems to me there are lots of cases. For example, like the things that Ted was giving in his talk yesterday, where people seem to accept examples when they're very complex, that have,
Okay.
you know, one too few verb phrases.
Yeah, okay.
Or cases where, you know, you have a lot of stuff in between the subject and the verb and they don't agree, but...
no, you're right. So I was being much too fast with a simple sentence. I think that doesn't make much sense. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe that's something that's absolutely wrong about my take, and that would require me to. Yeah, that's something I haven't thought about enough. You're right. Thank you, Holly.
Yeah. So I really like what you said, and I like everything you're doing. I just would like to suggest that I'm wondering why you don't want to push it further. So you seem to be taking usage preferences as this basic sort of primitive stuff that people learn. Wouldn't it be much nicer if these usage preferences themselves followed from some other principles, perhaps pragmatic principles, perhaps processing principles? But it seems to me that having identified these usage preferences, the next step one ought to be looking for is not just say, we've got this list of them, but from what do they derive?
Okay, no, I agree with that. I agree with that. But the thing is, I mean, I agree that that's what you would hope for, certainly. The question is it always possible? And that's what I'm not convinced of at this point. So I agree that once you say you have a usage preference, that should be a challenge for anyone who's interested to try to figure out something that is more fundamental and that would lead you to believe. I agree. But maybe you can't.
Oh, well.